Welcome to the channel. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to click like and subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. Your support helps us create more awesome videos for you. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Enjoy the video. Fuck this job. The words tasted like ash in Detective Ethan Hayes' mouth. 12 years. 12 years he'd worn the badge, loved the rhythm of the city, the satisfaction of bringing order to chaos, even the mundane paperwork. Now he was ready to throw it all away. He wouldn't be going in tonight. Not after the events of last night. Events that had cracked the foundation of his reality and left him teetering on the precipice of something monstrous. He remembered a simpler time, a memory sharp and clear amidst the encroaching darkness. 5 years ago, a fire on Elm Street. He'd pulled a little girl, Sarah, from a burning building, her soot-stained face beaming with gratitude as he carried her to safety. Her mother's tearful embrace, the cheers of the crowd, that was the reward. That was why he did this. He held on to that memory now, a flickering candle in a growing storm. He also remembered dinner with his wife Olivia just hours before the call. They'd eaten takeout Thai, laughing over a silly movie, their usual Friday night ritual. Olivia, with her warm smile and the way she always knew how to make him laugh, even on his worst days, she'd rested her hand on his, concerned. "You seem stressed, Ethan. More than usual. Talk to me." He'd brushed it off, blaming a tough case, promising her a weekend getaway. A promise he now knew he might never be able to keep. He'd been having trouble sleeping, plagued by nightmares of shadowy figures and echoing screams. He dismissed it as work stress, but now a chilling premonition seemed to cling to those dreams. It was 11:45 p.m. when the call came. Dispatcher Martha's voice, usually calm and collected, held a tremor of urgency. "Domestic disturbance, 1524 Willow Creek Apartments, Unit 307. Neighbor reports a woman screaming." It had been a slow night, the city holding its breath before the weekend's usual surge of activity. The call was almost a relief. Domestic disturbances were a mixed bag. Sometimes nothing, a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Sometimes something far worse. He'd learned to approach them with a cautious neutrality, a blend of empathy and authority. This one, though, felt different from the start. A prickling unease settled on him. A feeling he couldn't shake. He didn't activate the sirens, just a quiet rumble of the engine as he pulled onto the deserted street. The Willow Creek Apartments loomed, a monolith of brick and shadow against the inky sky. A few lights flickered in windows, eyes peering out, curious and wary. Ethan reported his arrival, Martha's voice crackling back through the radio, the static a discordant symphony in the night's quiet. He felt the stares as he walked past, the invisible weight of being the bearer of bad news, the harbinger of chaos. It always unsettled him, this feeling of being an outsider, even when he was there to help. The blinds closed as he passed, shutting out the unwelcome intrusion. He tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched, judged, persisted. He reached the stairs, the concrete cold and unforgiving beneath his boots. The third-floor hallway was a dimly lit tunnel, punctuated by buzzing fluorescent lights, their hum a constant, irritating drone. The air was heavy, stagnant, with a faint, metallic odor he couldn't quite place. It wasn't the usual smell of stale cigarettes and cheap cooking that permeated most apartment buildings. This was different. His hand instinctively drifted towards his holster, not quite gripping it, but close. He wasn't a trigger-happy cop, not like the ones splashed across the headlines, the ones who gave the rest of them a bad name. But years on the force had taught him that even the most ordinary situations could turn deadly in an instant. He was a grown man, yet a primal fear gnawed at him, the fear of the unseen, the unknown. He'd learned, however, that the real monsters weren't lurking in shadows. They were walking among us, hidden in plain sight. The abusive father, the cold-blooded killer, the seemingly ordinary neighbor with a darkness simmering beneath the surface. And then he saw her. Agnes, the old woman, was peering through a barely open door, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes wide and filled with a frantic terror that sent a shiver down his spine. He hadn't even heard the door creak. She beckoned him closer with a gnarled arthritic finger, her movements jerky and unnatural. His stomach churned. A wave of nausea washed over him, a visceral disgust that made him want to recoil. It was like looking at something decaying, something fundamentally wrong. Her hair was thin and patchy, revealing glimpses of her scalp. Her mouth was a grim, toothless line, her skin stretched taut over bone. "What took you so long?" Her voice was a raspy whisper, a mixture of fear and accusation. Ethan's mind, momentarily paralyzed by a strange mix of fear and revulsion, finally registered the apartment number, 307. This was the source of the call. He forced himself to regain his composure, his training kicking in. "Ma'am, I'm Detective Hayes. Can you tell me what happened?" She shushed him, her eyes darting down the hallway as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. One of the flickering lights above buzzed ominously, then went out, plunging that section of the hall into deeper darkness. Agnes practically pulled him inside, her grip surprisingly strong. "It's down the hall," she whispered, her breath hot and fetid on his face. "It's watching us." His chest tightened. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger, almost overpowering. A horrendous screech, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the air, ripped through the hallway. Ethan instinctively reached for his weapon, his heart hammering against his ribs. At the far end of the hall, where it intersected with another corridor, he saw her. The figure was female, naked, emaciated, her body trembling violently. She was crouched low to the ground, like a wounded animal. His left hand fumbled for his flashlight, his fingers clumsy and unresponsive. A part of him, a deep primal instinct, screamed at him not to illuminate her, not to see what was lurking in the shadows. But he had to. He flicked the switch. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the woman in stark detail. She was rocking back and forth, her long, matted hair obscuring her face. But there was no sound of crying, no whimpering, just the rhythmic creaking of her body. He called out, his voice strained. "Ma'am, are you all right? Can you hear me?" He knew the answer even before he spoke. She looked starved, her ribs visible beneath her skin, her limbs skeletal. He took a single step forward. Her body shuddered, a violent tremor that ran through her from head to toe. He tried to reassure her, his words hollow even to his own ears. "It's okay, I'm here to help." He reached for his radio, clipped to his chest to request EMS, but the radio was silent. No response, just static. And the woman had stopped shivering. A terrifying sense of dread washed over him. It felt like he'd stepped into a trap, a carefully laid snare. He tried to swallow, but his throat was constricted, his mouth bone dry. The air itself felt thick, poisonous. The woman's chest was heaving, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. He shifted his weight, a subtle movement, but it was enough. She lifted her head. The sight that greeted him was one of pure horror. Her mouth was sewn shut, the crude stitches pulling at her flesh, black, viscous fluid and droplets of blood dribbling down her chin. He couldn't see her eyes, still hidden behind her tangled hair, but the way the dark liquid streamed down her face, tracing the contours of her cheeks, told him all he needed to know. They too were sewn shut. The woman rose, unfolding from the floor with an unnatural grace, her movements fluid and predatory. Ethan's pistol was in his hand, his training taking over even as his mind screamed in denial. He stepped back, away from the unseen trigger, and the woman lunged. He fired, again and again. The muzzle flashes illuminated the hallway in a series of grotesque snapshots. The woman's body contorting, bullets tearing through flesh, yet she kept coming, propelled by some unholy force. He emptied the clip, the metallic click of the empty chamber echoing in the sudden silence. The last image burned into his retina was of her standing over him, her silhouette a dark, menacing shape, against the dim light of his dropped flashlight. He scrambled for the flashlight, his fingers fumbling in the darkness. He pointed it at the spot where she'd been standing, but she was gone. A door slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the hallway. He turned the light towards the noise, catching a glimpse of the woman's foot disappearing behind the door of Unit 307, Agnes' apartment. Ethan frantically reloaded, his hands shaking, and tried his radio again. This time, a voice answered, crackling with urgency. "Shots fired! Shots fired!" he yelled, his voice hoarse and desperate. He heard sirens in the distance, a faint wail that grew steadily louder. But from behind the closed door he heard another sound, Agnes's desperate pleas for help, her voice muffled but filled with terror. "Help is on the way," he shouted, knowing it was a lie. He heard a sickening squelch, the sound of flesh being torn, and Agnes's screams turned into a gurgling sob. He knew she was dying, that she wouldn't survive until backup arrived. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Fear, duty, self-preservation. He kicked at the door, once, twice, the wood splintering around the lock. "I'm dying," Agnes screamed, her voice weakening. He kicked again, the door bursting open. The room was silent. "Police, come out," he yelled, his voice trembling despite his attempt at authority. He swept the flashlight across the room, the beam illuminating a sparsely furnished living room. Agnes was standing in a corner, her back to him. "Show me your hands," he commanded. She didn't move. He cautiously approached her, his gun nuzzled against her shoulder. Still, no response. A lamp on a nearby table shattered, the sound exploding in the silence. Ethan whirled around, his flashlight beam landing on the figure crouched behind the sofa. The young woman. "Hands! Show me your fucking hands!" he screamed, his voice cracking. The woman slowly rose, her spine unfolding like a cobra preparing to strike. The stitches that had held her mouth closed were ripped apart, hanging loosely from her face, revealing rows of teeth filed down to sharp, predatory points. Her eyes, however, remained sewn shut. She opened her mouth, emitting a low, guttural hiss. Before Ethan could react, a searing pain exploded in his neck. Agnes. She had clamped her teeth onto his flesh, her once toothless mouth now filled with jagged fangs. The young woman stood motionless, listening to the struggle. Ethan clawed at Agnes, trying to pry her loose, bashing her head with the butt of his flashlight, punching her, pulling at her hair, but her grip was relentless, like a vice. He could hear the sickening sound of his own blood being drawn, feel the warmth of it flowing down his neck. His vision blurred, his legs grew weak. He was losing consciousness, drifting away. The world around him seemed to recede, replaced by a strange, heightened awareness. His eyes were failing, but he saw everything. He saw the spiders spinning their webs in the corner of the room, their tiny jaws working. He felt the earth turning beneath him, the cold night air, the distant warmth of the rising sun. He felt the building itself, aging, decaying, the wood rotting, the concrete crumbling. And he heard them. The apartment complex, which should have been filled with the sounds of sleeping residents, was eerily silent. Except for the things. He heard them pressing their ears against the walls, their stomachs growling, listening to Agnes feed on him, listening to his lifeblood draining away. His heart beat for the last time, a hollow thud that echoed in the emptiness. He felt no physical pain, only a growing, overwhelming dread. A car screeched to a halt outside. Backup had arrived. The two women retreated into the hallway, leaving Ethan's body on the floor. He heard the familiar voice of Officer David Miller, his friend, his partner on many calls, his voice crackling over the radio. David would have been his salvation, but now he was a threat. Ethan wanted to scream, to warn him, but he couldn't. He could only listen to the rhythmic thudding of David's heart, a sound that ignited a primal, terrifying hunger within him. The building was suddenly empty. The things had vanished, scattering into the night like roaches fleeing the light. David entered the apartment, his flashlight beam sweeping across the room. He found Ethan lying on the floor, his face pale, his eyes vacant. Dozens of officers arrived, securing the scene, yellow tape cordoning off the area. They placed Ethan in the back of an ambulance, attempting to take his vitals. He refused, his voice a low growl, telling them he was fine. They took his service weapon, standard procedure after an officer-involved shooting. He knew he'd be placed on desk duty, pending an investigation. But the thought of sitting in a room filled with the pulsing rhythm of living hearts filled him with a chilling dread. He returned home to find Olivia waiting, her face etched with worry. Someone from the precinct had called, telling her he'd been involved in an incident, that he was shaken up but unharmed. He smelled her fear, the faint, coppery scent of her blood, now tinged with a salty tang of anxiety. She rushed to him, embracing him tightly, trying to kiss him. He pulled away, his body rigid. He couldn't risk it. He couldn't risk the overwhelming urge to sink his teeth into her soft flesh. He spent the night on the couch, battling the monstrous hunger that gnawed at him, the image of Olivia's sleeping form a constant, agonizing temptation. He stood over her, his body trembling with the effort to restrain himself. He traced his tongue along her skin, tasting the salt of her sweat, the delicate fragrance of her perfume. She stirred, playfully pushing him away, her fingers brushing against the back of his head. It was a gesture of affection, a familiar comfort. He remembered countless times she'd done the same, soothing him after a nightmare, calming him after a stressful shift. Now, that same touch ignited a firestorm within him. He lost control. The next thing he knew, Olivia lay lifeless beneath him. He waited for her to awaken, to transform as he had, but she remained still, her eyes vacant, her skin cold. He had killed her. The hunger was momentarily sated, but the emptiness that remained was far worse. He had destroyed the one person he loved most in the world. This was meant to be his suicide note. But the bullet he put through his head had no effect. He wanted to die, to escape this monstrous existence, but he couldn't. Someone would come looking for him when he didn't show up for his shift. Detective Reynolds, probably his superior, a stern but fair man who had always had Ethan's back. He didn't want to hurt anyone else, but the hunger was growing again, stronger than before. He was torn. A part of him hoped they would stay away, that he would be left alone to rot. Another part, a darker, more insidious part, craved the sound of approaching footsteps, the scent of living flesh. He wasn't sure he could restrain himself anymore. He wasn't sure he wanted to. Days blurred into nights. Ethan remained holed up in his apartment, the curtains drawn, the world outside a distant, fading memory. He tried to ration the remaining blood he'd collected from Olivia, but it wasn't enough. The hunger was a constant, gnawing presence, driving him to the brink of madness. He heard the whispers. At first he thought it was his imagination, the product of his guilt and isolation. But they grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to emanate from the walls, from the very fabric of the building. Join us, feed, embrace the darkness. He knew it was them, the creatures from the apartment complex, the ones who had infected him, who had turned him into this thing. They were tempting him, calling to him, promising him. What? Power? Belonging? An end to the torment? He tried to resist, clinging to the last vestiges of his humanity. He replayed memories of Olivia, of his life before, of the good he had done as a police officer. But the memories were fading, becoming distorted, like images viewed through a cracked mirror. One night, there was a knock at the door. Ethan froze, his senses on high alert. He could smell the person on the other side, hear their heartbeat, a strong, steady rhythm that sent a jolt of agonizing hunger through him. Ethan? It's Detective Reynolds. Open up. We need to talk. Reynolds' voice was calm but firm. Ethan knew he couldn't hide forever. He considered his options, each one more terrifying than the last. He could attack Reynolds, feed, and succumb to the darkness. He could try to run, but where would he go? He could try to explain, but who would believe him? He made his choice. He wasn't sure if it was the right one, but it was the only one he could make. He slowly opened the door. Reynolds stood in the hallway, his face a mixture of concern and suspicion. He held a file in his hand, probably Ethan's personnel file, filled with commendations, reports, and now a record of the events at Willow Creek. "Ethan," Reynolds said, his voice softening slightly. "You look like hell. We've been worried about you." "What happened, Ethan?" Reynolds repeated, his voice softening slightly. "You look like hell. We've been worried about you. What happened at Willow Creek?" He stepped into the apartment, his eyes scanning the darkened room, taking in the drawn curtains, the disarray, the unsettling stillness. The air was heavy, stagnant, and carried that same faint metallic odor Reynolds had noticed faintly at the scene. But stronger now, almost cloying. Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. The words wouldn't come, replaced by a guttural growl that rumbled in his chest. He backed away from Reynolds, his hands clenching and unclenching, his body trembling with a mixture of hunger and terror. Reynolds noticed the movement, the unnatural stiffness in Ethan's posture, the way his eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. He placed a hand on his own holster, not drawing his weapon, but ready. "Ethan, talk to me. We reviewed the security footage. There's discrepancies. The woman you shot, we can't find her body. And Agnes Miller, the coroner's report is bizarre." Ethan flinched at the mention of Agnes's name. The memory of her teeth sinking into his neck, the feeling of his lifeblood draining away, surged back with nauseating force. He could still hear the whispers, the insidious voices urging him to give in, to embrace the darkness. "He knows. He suspects," Reynolds continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Witnesses, other officers on the scene reported you were unresponsive, almost catatonic. You refused medical treatment, and then you disappeared. We need answers, Ethan. What aren't you telling us?" Ethan tried to speak, to explain the impossible, to convey the horror of what he had become. But all that came out was a choked sob, a sound filled with pain and despair. He stumbled backward, bumping into the coffee table, the Corinth, sending a stack of old newspapers and Olivia's favorite mug crashing to the floor. The shattered ceramic, the lingering scent of coffee, a stark reminder of the life he had lost. Reynolds took another step forward, his hand still resting on his holster. "Ethan, I'm your friend. I want to help you. But you have to cooperate. Tell me what happened." The hunger was overwhelming now, a burning fire in his gut. He could smell Reynolds' blood, hear the pounding of his heart, a tempting rhythm that drowned out the whispers, the memories, everything except the primal need to feed. He lunged. Reynolds reacted instantly, drawing his weapon, his movements honed by years of training. But Ethan was faster, inhumanly fast. He slammed into Reynolds, knocking the gun from his hand, sending it skittering across the floor. They grappled, Reynolds fighting with the strength and skill of a seasoned officer, Ethan with the ferocity of a cornered animal. Ethan's teeth found Reynolds' neck. The world exploded in a rush of sensation. The taste of blood, hot and metallic, filled his mouth. He felt Reynolds' body go limp, his struggles weakening, his heartbeat slowing. A wave of guilt, of horror washed over him, but it was quickly overwhelmed by a surge of satisfaction. The hunger was momentarily sated, the gnawing emptiness replaced by a fleeting sense of fullness. He released Reynolds' body, letting it slump to the floor. He stood there, panting, his hands and face covered in blood, his mind reeling. He had done it again. He had killed another friend, another innocent person. The whispers were louder now, triumphant, welcoming him to the fold. "You are one of us. There is no turning back. Embrace your power." He looked down at Reynolds' body, at the lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling. He saw the fear, the confusion, the betrayal. He saw his own reflection in those dead eyes, a reflection of the monster he had become. He knew he couldn't stay here. The police would be back, and this time they wouldn't be so understanding. He had to leave, to disappear, to find a place where he could exist without causing more harm. But where could he go? He was a creature of the night, a predator, a pariah. He thought of the whispers of the creatures in the apartment building. They had called to him, offered him a place among them. Was that his only option? To join the darkness? To become one of the monsters he had once hunted? He stumbled out of the apartment, leaving behind the shattered remnants of his former life. He moved through the city streets like a ghost, unseen, unnoticed, a shadow lurking in the darkness. He avoided the brightly lit areas, the crowds, the places where he might be recognized. He stuck to the alleys, the back streets, the forgotten corners of the city. He found himself drawn to the Willow Creek Apartments, the place where it had all begun. The building loomed before him, a silent, menacing presence. He could sense them inside, the things waiting, watching. He could hear their whispers, their calls, growing stronger, more insistent. Come home. Join us. You belong here. He hesitated, standing at the edge of the parking lot, torn between the remnants of his humanity and the overwhelming pull of the darkness. He knew that if he went inside, there would be no turning back. He would be lost forever. But he was already lost. He took a step forward, then another, his movements slow, deliberate. He walked towards the building, towards the shadows, towards the creatures that awaited him. He was no longer Detective Ethan Hayes. He was something else, something more, or perhaps something less. He reached the entrance, the door swinging open silently, as if inviting him in. He stepped inside, the darkness swallowing him whole. The whispers intensified, surrounding him, enveloping him. He heard the scuttling of feet, the rustling of clothes, the low, guttural growls. He saw them then, emerging from the shadows, their forms distorted, their eyes glowing with an unholy light. They were no longer just the old woman and the young woman. There were dozens of them, all different shapes and sizes, all bearing the marks of their horrific transformation. Agnes, her face even more grotesque than before, stepped forward, a twisted smile on her lips. "Welcome, Ethan," she rasped, her voice a chilling echo in the silence. "Welcome home." He didn't resist. He didn't fight. He simply closed his eyes, surrendering to the darkness, to the hunger, to the inevitable. He was one of them now. He was home. But even in the darkness, a flicker of his former self remained. A faint memory of Olivia, of her smile, of her warmth, of the life they had shared. A single tear, not of blood but of genuine sorrow, traced a path down his cheek. It was a tear for the man he had been, for the life he had lost, for the monster he had become. And in that single tear, a sliver of hope, however faint, however futile, remained. Perhaps one day he could find a way to reclaim his humanity, to atone for his sins, to break free from the curse of the night shift. But for now, he was lost, consumed by the darkness, a hunter in the shadows, forever haunted by the ghosts of his past. He would start hunting the hunters. He would start with the building, cleansing it, ridding himself of the old woman. His old life was over. A new, dark chapter was just beginning.